They bought my younger sister a brand new car for her 17th birthday. It had a giant red velvet bow on the hood and custom leather seats. When I turned 17, they handed me a laminated city bus pass and told me that taking public transit builds character. I kept that pass for 16 years. They never realized it would be the exact same ticket I would use to dismantle their fake empire and leave them with absolutely nothing. My name is Olivia. I am 33 years old and a forensic accountant specializing in corporate financial fraud. I spend my days tracing hidden money, analyzing bank statements, and exposing liars in court. Last Friday, my parents invited me to a Michelin-starred restaurant in downtown Chicago. I assumed it was just an overpriced dinner to celebrate my sister getting engaged. Instead, it was a calculated ambush. Before I get into the exact details of how I systematically destroyed their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to sit across a dining table from toxic relatives who only view you as a walking bank account. The restaurant was ridiculously lavish. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over our private booth. The leather-bound menus did not even have prices listed. My father Richard sat at the head of the table wearing a tailored suit he definitely could not afford. My mother Patricia was dripping in pearls, sipping her third glass of vintage champagne. Next to them sat my 30-year-old sister Brittany, flashing a massive diamond ring and complaining about the lighting. Her fiancé Terrence sat quietly across from me. Terrence is a brilliant 32-year-old African-American tech entrepreneur. He built his software company from the ground up. His family is highly successful, deeply respected, and entirely self-made. My father, on the other hand, is a shady construction contractor who is desperately obsessed with maintaining the grand illusion of white-collar country club wealth. He is terrified of looking inferior to anyone, especially a man who actually earned his fortune. The waiter had barely cleared our imported caviar appetizer plates when my father leaned forward and folded his hands. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile that made my skin crawl. "Olivia," he started, clearing his throat loudly to command the table. "As you know, Brittany and Terrence are planning a magnificent wedding for next spring. Terrence comes from a very proud, hard-working family. We are a family of high social standing. We simply cannot let his relatives look down on us. We need to throw a wedding that proves our absolute status in this city." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, my eyes locked on his. "And what exactly does that have to do with me?" I asked calmly. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary affection she only used when she wanted money. "Well, sweetheart, we know you have that beautiful house you bought a few years ago. You have built up so much equity in it. We need you to take out a second mortgage for $150,000. It will easily cover the floral arrangements, the country club venue, and the catering." I stared at her, genuinely wondering if the champagne had entirely fried her brain. "You want me to mortgage my home, the house I bought with my own money after years of working 80-hour weeks to pay for Brittany to have a luxury party?" My father slammed his heavy hand on the table, rattling the expensive silver cutlery. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between us. "It is your fundamental duty as the older sister," my father hissed, dropping the sweet act entirely. His face turned a dark shade of red. "Terrence has a wealthy family. We cannot look cheap in front of them. You are single. You do not have a husband or children to spend your money on. You are being completely selfish by hoarding your wealth while your sister needs to secure her future in high society. Stop being so bitter and do what is right for this family for once in your life." Brittany pouted her lips, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes that she had perfected since childhood. "Please, Olivia," she whined, reaching across the table. "It is my special day. I deserve the best. You owe me this." I looked at the four of them. Terrence looked deeply embarrassed by the entire exchange, completely unaware of the massive financial rot hiding beneath my parents' designer clothes. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to look for discrepancies. I look for the gap between the story people tell and the numbers they desperately hide. Looking at my father sweating and my mother nervously gripping her champagne flute, I saw the absolute truth. This was not just about a wedding. This was a shakedown. They were drowning in debt, and they needed my clean credit to bail out their sinking ship. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not cause a scene in the beautiful dining room. I just felt a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire body. My father wanted to talk about duty, sacrifice, and character. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He was about to get a brutal masterclass in all three. I reached into my designer handbag, moving past my leather wallet and house keys, and pulled out a small rectangular object sealed in thick plastic. I placed it on the pristine white linen tablecloth right between my father's crystal water glass and his expensive plate of imported caviar. With one manicured finger, I slid the object across the smooth table until it rested directly in front of him. "I am not signing any bank papers," I said, my voice perfectly steady and quiet enough that only our private booth could hear. "I am not taking out a second mortgage on my property, and I am absolutely not funding a country club fantasy to stroke your fragile ego." My mother gasped loudly, pressing a trembling hand to her pearl necklace as if I had just slapped her. Brittany instantly let out a sharp, dramatic whine, turning to Terence to seek his comfort. But Terence was not looking at her. He was staring intently at the mysterious object on the table. My father looked down at it, his thick eyebrows pulling together in utter confusion. It took him a few long seconds to recognize the faded blue and white piece of paper trapped inside the heavy plastic lamination. "Do you remember what that is?" I asked, leaning back against the leather booth. "Because I remember the exact day you gave it to me." My father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "When Brittany turned 17, I continued addressing the table but keeping my cold eyes locked entirely on him. You threw a massive party in our backyard. You blindfolded her, led her out to the concrete driveway, and surprised her with a brand new Toyota. It had custom leather seats and a giant red velvet bow resting on the hood. You paid for it entirely in cash. You stood there with a microphone and told everyone how proud you were of your youngest daughter." Brittany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her massive diamond ring catching the chandelier light as she nervously played with her linen napkin. "Exactly 1 year earlier, I said, my tone remaining entirely conversational. When I turned 17, we did not have a party. We sat alone in the kitchen. You handed me that exact city bus pass sitting right in front of you. You did not even bother to buy a birthday card. You just slid it across the marble kitchen island and told me that I needed to figure out my own way to high school and my part-time job. When I asked why I was not getting a car like the other kids in our affluent neighborhood, you looked me dead in the eye and said, 'Taking public transit builds character.'" Terence shifted his deep gaze from the expired bus pass to my father, his expression hardening into quiet realization. He was a brilliant businessman, and he was rapidly starting to put the pieces together. "You see, Terence," I said finally, looking directly at my future brother-in-law. "My father loves to talk about character and wealth, but his reality is a completely different story." Grandma Beatrice knew that. She was sitting in the corner of the kitchen the day he handed me that bus pass. She watched him humiliate me while preparing to spoil his golden child. She did not yell at him. She did not argue or make a scene. Grandma Beatrice was a fiercely intelligent woman who understood that the absolute best revenge is financial dominance. She stayed completely silent and bided her time. I turned my attention back to my father, watching a bead of sweat start to form on his wrinkled forehead. "You clearly remember my 18th birthday, do you not?" I asked softly. "You were pacing the living room floor because the bank was threatening to repossess your prized vintage Porsche. You had poured tens of thousands of dollars into restoring that beautiful car, treating it with more love and respect than you ever treated me. But your construction business was failing, your hidden debts were piling up, and you could not make the massive monthly payments. You lied and told everyone it was simply a clerical bank error." My mother looked down at her lap, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. On the morning of my 18th birthday, I continued a loud tow truck pulled into our driveway. You ran outside in your bathrobe screaming at the driver, threatening to call your expensive lawyers. But the driver just ignored your tantrum. He walked right past your red screaming face, looked at me standing quietly on the porch, and asked if I was Olivia. When I nodded yes, he handed me a shiny set of keys and pointed to the beautiful vintage Porsche strapped securely to the back of his truck. Grandma Beatrice had been quietly tracking your total financial collapse, I said, letting the heavy words hang in the air. When the bank finally foreclosed on your precious luxury car, she swooped in and bought it at a private auction for pennies on the dollar. Then she legally transferred the title directly into my name as my 18th birthday present. I kept the bus pass, I said, tapping the laminated card once. I kept it to remind myself exactly who you are. You were bankrupt back then, and you are bankrupt right now. You are sitting here aggressively demanding I risk my secure home to pay for a lavish wedding, claiming it is for our family honor. But the brutal truth is you do not have a single dime to your name, and you are terrified Terrence will find out you are a total fraud. So no, I will never sign your papers. My mother slammed her champagne glass down so hard, I am surprised the delicate crystal did not shatter. The sickeningly sweet smile melted off her face, replaced by a vicious sneer. You are completely delusional, Olivia. She spat out, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. You have always had this sick, twisted imagination. Your father is a respected businessman. You are just a bitter, jealous spinster who cannot stand to see her younger sister happy. You have no husband. You have no prospects. You spend your life staring at spreadsheets, so you sit there inventing these insane lies to punish Brittany because she found a wonderful man and you have nobody. Brittany immediately played her part, burying her face in her hands and letting out a loud, theatrical sob. "Why are you doing this to me?" she cried, peeking through her fingers to make sure Terrence was watching. "I just wanted my sister to be part of my special day." Terrence did not comfort her. He did not put his arm around her shoulder or whisper sweet reassurances. He just sat there, his jaw clenched, his sharp eyes moving methodically between my father, sweating profusely, my mother projecting her venom, and me sitting perfectly still. As a self-made tech founder, Terrence knew how to read a room, and he was currently reading the absolute worst business deal of his life. My father leaned across the table, invading my personal space. The veins in his neck were bulging against his tight silk collar. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, dropping his voice into a menacing growl. "You think because you wear a fancy blazer and work at some downtown accounting firm that you hold all the cards. You do not hold anything. I am your father. I built you, and if you refuse to sign those mortgage documents voluntarily, I will just go to the bank and sign them for you." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by his audacity. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" I asked. A cruel, triumphant smile crept across his red face. He leaned back, crossing his arms like a mob boss who had just won a game of chess. "You always were too focused on the numbers to read the fine print," he boasted. "When you turned 18, right before you left for college, I had you sign a stack of documents. I told you they were standard financial aid forms and medical emergency proxies. You signed every single page without reading them. One of those documents was a durable power of attorney. It gives me full legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. I still have it in my safe. I can walk into any bank in this city, present that legal document, and take out a second mortgage on your precious house whether you agree to it or not." My mother let out a short, haughty laugh, regaining her fake composure. She took another sip of her champagne. "You should have just played nice, Olivia," she said smugly. "Now we are going to get the money anyway, and you are not even invited to the wedding." The sheer level of delusion at that table was breathtaking. They honestly believed an outdated, fraudulently obtained piece of paper from 15 years ago would magically bypass modern banking regulations and forensic fraud detection. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They did not realize they had just confessed to attempted financial fraud in front of a key witness. I did not argue. I did not try to explain the complex legal reasons why his outdated power of attorney would instantly flag a federal banking review. I simply opened my purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I placed it neatly next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. "That covers my garden salad and the tip," I said, making sure my voice was loud enough for the waiter standing near our booth to hear. "I am not paying for your caviar, and I am certainly not paying for your champagne." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored pencil skirt. I looked down at my father, who was still wearing that arrogant, pathetic smirk. I let a cold, genuine smile spread across my face. "Try it, Dad," I challenged him, keeping my tone terrifyingly calm. "Take that 15-year-old document to the bank tomorrow morning. Try to legally bind my property to your massive hidden debts. Let us see if the IRS knocks on your front door before the bank even finishes processing your loan application." The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. He knew exactly what the IRS would find if they started digging into his shell companies. I picked up my purse and turned to Terrence, who was still sitting in total silence, absorbing the toxic reality of the family he was about to marry into. "It was lovely to finally meet you, Terrence," I said politely. "Good luck with the wedding planning." Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant. I left them sitting there, with an unpaid bill, an expired bus pass, and the creeping realization that they had messed with the wrong daughter. The next morning started like any other Tuesday. I woke up at 6, brewed a strong pot of black coffee, and sat at my kitchen island to review some corporate tax files before heading into the office. My phone was completely silent until exactly 7:30. Then it began vibrating across the granite countertop with a terrifying intensity. Notifications flooded the screen faster than I could read them. Text messages from distant relatives, missed calls from college acquaintances I had not spoken to in a decade, and a relentless stream of social media alerts. I unlocked my phone and tapped the first text message. It was from my cousin. It just contained a link and the words, "You need to see this right now." I clicked the link. It opened a video application. There was my 30-year-old sister Brittany staring directly into the camera lens. She was sitting on the floor of my parents' walk-in closet, strategically framed by rows of designer shoes and luxury handbags. She had clearly spent a good 20 minutes carefully smudging her waterproof mascara to look like she had been crying all night. Her blonde hair was a messy, relatable knot. It was a masterclass in digital manipulation. "Hey guys." Brittany started, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical vulnerability. "I did not want to make this video, I really did not. But I am just so broken right now, and I need a safe space to talk." I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching her performance with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. "As most of you know," she continued, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek, "I am marrying the love of my life, Terrence, next spring. Terrence is a brilliant, self-made black man. He is everything I ever dreamed of. But my family, specifically, my older sister Olivia, refuses to accept our happiness. She is legally in control of a family fund that was meant to pay for my wedding. And last night, at a family dinner, she completely cut me off. She refused to sign the paperwork. She told my parents she would rather burn her money than see me marry a man like Terrence." I nearly choked on my coffee. The sheer audacity of her lie was almost impressive. She had taken a conversation about me refusing to mortgage my own private property to fund her luxury party and weaponized it into a viral story of racial discrimination. She knew exactly what she was doing. By framing me as a jealous, racist villain trying to sabotage an interracial marriage, she guaranteed the internet would instantly rally behind her. "She is so deeply jealous of my relationship," Brittany sobbed, burying her face in her hands for dramatic effect. "She cannot stand that Terrence is successful. She cannot stand that he is black and thriving. She is using her financial control to punish us. I am just a bride trying to plan a wedding, and my own sister is trying to ruin my life out of pure spite." The video was less than 3 minutes long, but the damage was astronomical. I glanced at the metrics underneath her post. 3.2 million views, 400,000 likes, Over 50,000 comments, and the numbers were climbing by the second. I scrolled through the comment section. It was a digital witch hunt. Thousands of strangers were calling me a monster. Influencers with blue checkmarks were stitching her video offering to start crowdfunding campaigns to pay for her wedding. People were demanding that the internet find out who I was, where I worked, and destroy my life. Brittany had unleashed a virtual mob, knowing full well that an angry internet never pauses to verify the truth before burning someone at the stake. My phone buzzed again. It was an automated alert from an online forum. Someone had already found my full name and linked my professional profile. My forensic accounting firm was starting to receive fake one-star reviews, claiming I was an unethical, bigoted monster. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have immediately recorded an emotional apology video or desperately posted screenshots of text messages trying to defend their character against the crushing weight of public opinion. Brittany was banking on that. She wanted me to scramble. She wanted me to call her begging and pleading for her to take the video down, willing to sign whatever bank documents she wanted just to make the nightmare stop. Instead, I set my phone down on the counter. I felt a cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. Brittany thought she was playing a game of public relations. She did not realize I play a game of forensic destruction. She wanted to invite the entire internet to look at our family finances. I was going to give them a front row seat. I opened my laptop, bypassing my usual morning tasks, and logged directly into my secure investigative servers. My family wanted to use Terrence as a shield for their financial crimes. I was going to use my expertise to dissect their entire existence. My phone rang abruptly. It was the managing partner at my forensic accounting firm. His voice was tight with panic as he asked if I had seen our company directory page. I opened my web browser and navigated to our corporate website. Our pristine 5-star rating had plummeted to a dismal 2.1 in a matter of hours. The review section was an absolute war zone. Hundreds of fake 1-star reviews flooded the page, calling me an unethical monster, a racist, and a complete disgrace to the financial industry. People who had never even met me were tagging the state licensing board on LinkedIn, demanding they immediately revoke my professional credentials. My boss nervously suggested I take an immediate leave of absence and issue a public apology video to defuse the angry mob. I told him absolutely not. I instructed him to leave every single fake review right where it was. I promised him that by the end of the month, our firm would have the most spectacular marketing campaign in its entire history. I hung up the phone completely unfazed by the digital noise and turned my full attention to the real battle. As a certified fraud examiner, I have legal access to high-level investigative tools that the general public does not even know exist. I bypassed the standard search engines and logged into secure financial databases, the exact kind used to track money laundering cartels and corporate embezzlement rings. I started my inquiry with my father. For decades, Richard had projected the grand image of a wealthy, successful real estate developer. He constantly bragged about his luxury construction firm at country club mixers and charity galas. I pulled his corporate filings. The reality was a pathetic house of cards. His business was a messy labyrinth of shell companies all registered to a cheap strip mall in Delaware to avoid scrutiny. I ran a targeted search on public tax liens and hit the jackpot immediately. He had not paid corporate taxes in 3 years. His primary business was practically insolvent. But that raised a glaring question. If his company was completely dead, how was he funding his lavish lifestyle? How was he paying for the leased Mercedes, the tailored silk suits, and the expensive Michelin-star dinners? I expanded my search parameters, pulling the banking history connected to his active shell companies. The money had to be coming from somewhere. Next, I turned my attention to Brittany. In her viral video, she portrayed herself as a helpless, financially dependent bride, just trying to afford her dream wedding. I ran her name through an advanced skip tracing software. Brittany had not held a legitimate job since she graduated college, yet her credit card payments were perfectly on time every single month. I ran a forensic cross-reference to track the exact origin of the funds paying off her massive shopping bills. The payments were not coming from my father. They were coming from a corporate account linked to a completely different newly formed entity. I pulled the incorporation documents for this unknown entity. My father was listed as the registered agent, which meant he legally controlled the flow of money, but the primary capital injecting into the account was completely foreign. He was funneling massive amounts of cash through a secondary source, washing it through this hidden company, and using it to secretly fund both his lifestyle and Brittany's extravagant spending habits. They were operating a highly sophisticated financial drain, and looking at the routing numbers, I knew exactly who the victim was. I needed to set a trap. The absolute best way to catch a financial criminal is to let them believe they have completely outsmarted you. You do not block their path. You open the door wider and wait for them to walk directly into federal jurisdiction. My father had threatened to use that fraudulently obtained power of attorney from 15 years ago to take out a second mortgage on my home. A desperate man drowning in debt and facing public humiliation will always make a reckless move. I logged into my personal banking portal. I did not freeze my credit. I did not call the credit bureaus to issue a standard fraud alert. Instead, I placed silent, highly encrypted tripwires across my social security number and all my property deeds. I configured an alert system that would bypass standard notifications and route directly to my private server. If anyone attempted to run a credit check, apply for a loan, or leverage my property using my credentials, I would instantly receive the exact location, the computer address, and the name of the bank branch processing the request. I was not going to stop my father from trying to steal my house. I was going to let him commit wire fraud and identity theft in broad daylight, fully documented with a digital paper trail that no defense attorney could ever erase. The trap was set. Now I just needed to talk to Terrence. I reached for my office phone, but my intercom buzzed first. My receptionist announced an unannounced visitor in the lobby. It was Terrence. I told her to send him straight back. When my heavy oak door clicked open, he walked in looking like a man who had not slept in days. The sharp tech founder from the restaurant was completely gone. In his place stood an exhausted guy in a rumpled hoodie with dark circles under his eyes. He collapsed heavily into the guest chair across from my desk. "Olivia, I am so sorry about the video," he said, his voice thick with genuine fatigue. "I told Brittany to take it down immediately, but she claims she lost access to her account. The internet mob is completely out of control. I know your firm is taking a hit. I just want this entire nightmare to end." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather checkbook. Unclicking an expensive pen, he flattened the book on his knee. "I will write you a personal check right now for $150,000, he offered, looking up with desperate eyes. "Just take the money, sign whatever paperwork your parents are demanding, and let us buy some peace. I love Brittany, and I just want our wedding to happen without any more of this toxic drama." I watched him prepare to sign away his hard-earned wealth to appease a family of parasites. It was a noble gesture, but exactly what my parents were banking on. They knew Terrence was too polite to cause a scene and too wealthy to notice a few missing drops. I leaned across my desk and placed my hand gently over his, stopping the pen. "Put your checkbook away, Terrence," I said softly. "I do not want your money, and I am certainly not giving my parents a single dime." Terrence looked deeply confused. He pulled his hand back. "Then what do you want, Olivia?" he asked, frustration bleeding into his tone. "Brittany says you are holding the family funds hostage out of spite. Your father says you are having a financial crisis. I cannot solve a problem if no one will tell me the actual truth." I smiled a sad, knowing smile. "The truth is that my family is entirely broke," I explained. "They do not have a family fund. They do not have savings. They are drowning in debt, and they are using you as a giant walking ATM machine." Terrence frowned, shaking his head. "That makes no sense," he argued. "Brittany does not have any money either. She is a bride. She does not work. I pay for her apartment, her car, and her credit cards. She relies on me completely. That is exactly what she wants you to think, I replied. I stood up and walked around to the side of my desk. I grabbed the edge of my large computer monitor and physically turned the screen around so it was facing him directly. Take a very close look at these spreadsheets, Terrence. I am a forensic accountant. I track missing money for a living. Right now, the money going missing is yours. Terrence leaned forward, his eyes scanning the glowing rows of data. What am I looking at? He asked, his voice tightening as his analytical brain processed the numbers. You are looking at a highly organized systemic theft, I told him, pointing to a specific column. Brittany is not a helpless, broke bride. Every single time she uses the premium credit cards you gave her, she is not just buying designer shoes or paying for wedding vendors. She uses a third-party payment processor to artificially inflate the charges. She submits a fake invoice, pays it with your card, and then routes the excess cash through a shell company my father set up. Terrence stared blankly at the screen. The color slowly drained from his face. I scrolled down to the bottom line of the financial report. Over the past year, I explained calmly, Brittany has been siphoning exactly $10,000 a month from your accounts. She is funneling all of that stolen cash directly into a secret offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands, a trust solely registered in her name. Terrence did not speak. The exhaustion in his posture completely vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. He was no longer the tired fiancé trying to keep the peace. He was a brilliant CEO looking at concrete evidence of corporate sabotage happening inside his own home. He slowly reached out and touched the edge of the monitor. The blindfold was off, and he was finally ready to fight back. Terrence stared at the monitor for a long time. The silence in my office was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of downtown traffic. He did not yell or throw anything. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. He opened his banking app, cross-referencing the dates on my spreadsheet with his own transaction history. When he looked back up at me, the devastation in his eyes was quickly hardening into pure analytical rage. Madison, he said quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger. She told me she needed that secondary credit card to pay for the florist and the venue deposits. She said the vendors required separate routing for accounting purposes. I trusted her. I walked back to my chair and sat down. Fraudsters always rely on trust, Terrence. It is their primary currency. They bank on the fact that decent people do not wake up every morning expecting to be robbed by the people they love. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees. So what is the plan? Do I confront her tonight? Do I cancel the cards and demand she close the offshore account? I shook my head. No. If you confront Brittany now, she will panic. She will immediately empty that offshore account, transfer the cash to an untraceable crypto wallet, and go running to my parents. They will spin another narrative, probably claiming you are financially abusing her, and they will try to bury the evidence. We need to be smarter than that. We need to look at the entire board. Terrence nodded slowly, his tech CEO mindset taking over. You said your father is broke, but he is still funneling cash through a shell company. Where is the rest of the money coming from? $10,000 a month from Brittany is a lot, but it is not enough to keep his failing construction business afloat and pay for his country club lifestyle. That is exactly what I am trying to figure out, I replied, turning my keyboard back toward me. I need your permission to run a full diagnostic on your personal credit history. Not just the accounts you share with Brittany, but your entire financial footprint. If my father is involved in this, I need to see if he has touched anything else. Do it, Terrence said without hesitation. I will authorize whatever you need. Find every single leak. I logged into my highest clearance federal database, a portal that allowed me to pull comprehensive credit profiles using advanced skip tracing parameters. I entered Terrence's full name, his current address, and his date of birth. Then I asked him for his social security number. He recited the 9 digits, and I typed them into the secure search bar. I hit enter. The system took a few seconds to compile the data. When the results populated on the screen, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The file was massive. It was not just a list of his personal tech company credit lines and his standard mortgage. It was a sprawling network of high-yield commercial debt. Terrence, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you recently co-sign any commercial loans for a real estate development project in the suburbs? No. He answered immediately, standing up and walking around the desk to stand behind my chair. My company focuses entirely on software and cloud infrastructure. I have zero investments in physical real estate development. Why? I pointed to a cluster of red-flagged accounts at the bottom of the screen. Because according to the Federal Credit Bureau, you are currently listed as the primary guarantor on 3 massive commercial construction loans. Terrence leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the data. What the hell is this? He muttered. I have never heard of these lenders. I clicked on the details for the largest loan, a massive line of credit totaling over $2 million. The loan was issued to a limited liability company called Apex Build Group. I recognized the name instantly. It was one of my father's many shell companies, the one he had bragged about starting last year, to handle his so-called luxury expansions. I clicked further into the loan origination documents, the digital copies of the applications loaded on the screen. My stomach dropped. There at the bottom of the guarantor page was Terrence's name, his home address, and his exact social security number. Next to his printed name was a crude, digitally forged copy of his signature. My father did not just use Brittany to steal your cash, I said, feeling a sudden overwhelming wave of disgust for the man who raised me. He stole your identity. He used your pristine credit score and your tech company's valuation to secure millions of dollars in fraudulent business loans. He has been taking out massive lines of credit in your name to fund his dead construction company. Terrence stared at the forged signature on the screen. The reality of the betrayal hit him like a physical blow. This is not just credit card theft, Madison. This is federal wire fraud. This is identity theft on a massive scale. If these loans default, the banks will come after my company. They will liquidate everything I have built. They will not get the chance I promised him, my voice turning to ice. My father thinks he is a mastermind because he managed to fool a few automated banking algorithms. He forgot that his oldest daughter is literally trained to dismantle financial criminals. Terrence looked at me, the anger in his eyes now entirely focused and lethal. What do we do now? We let them keep digging, I said, pulling up a new secure file on my desktop. We are not going to just stop the bleeding. We are going to build a federal case so airtight that they will never see the inside of a country club again. We are going to let them think they are winning right up until the moment we destroy them. While Terrence and I were sitting in my office, building a federal indictment, my parents were 20 miles away in their sprawling suburban mansion, blissfully unaware of the trap closing around them. I did not have to be in the room to know exactly how the afternoon played out. My father later confessed the exact details of his little celebration during his federal deposition, a memory he will get to replay in his head for the next 15 years. According to the court transcripts, the notification arrived just past 3 o'clock. Richard was sitting in his mahogany-paneled study, a room designed entirely to look like old money. The computer screen lit up with an email from a major commercial lender. He clicked it open, his eyes scanning the digital letterhead. It was an official notice of funding. The $500,000 commercial line of credit he had applied for using Terrence's identity had just been fully approved, and the funds were actively being wired to the Apex Build Group account. Richard let out a loud, triumphant shout that echoed down the sweeping marble hallway. He marched into the designer kitchen, where my mother was flipping through a luxury bridal magazine. He grabbed a bottle of imported French champagne from the chilled wine fridge, the kind that costs more than a monthly car payment, and popped the cork with a loud crack. "We did it, Patricia," my father announced, pouring the bubbling liquid into 2 crystal flutes. "The bank just wired $500,000. Apex is fully funded. We are completely clear." My mother slammed her magazine shut, her eyes lighting up with absolute greed. She took the glass from his hand and took a deep, satisfied sip. "I told you that boy was a golden goose," she sneered, referring to the brilliant tech CEO she was supposedly so proud to welcome into the family. He is so busy playing the Silicon Valley visionary that he does not even monitor his own credit footprint. And Madison thought she could starve us out. She is probably sitting in her depressing little cubicle right now thinking she actually won. Brittany walked into the kitchen right on cue, carrying her tiny designer lapdog. When she heard the news about the loan, she actually squealed with delight. "This is perfect." She clapped her hands together. "Since you got the business loan sorted, that means I can keep routing my wedding budget into my private trust, right? Because Terrence just authorized another 50 grand for the floral installations and the custom ice sculptures. I can probably skim at least 20 of that by the end of the week." Richard laughed, a deep booming sound of pure arrogance. "Skim whatever you want, sweetheart," he told her, raising his glass in a toast. "The groom is paying for it all one way or another." To family wealth. To family wealth, my mother and sister echoed in unison, clinking their crystal glasses together. They stood in that ridiculous gourmet kitchen, surrounded by imported marble and stolen money, thoroughly convinced they were the smartest people in the state. They honestly believed they had executed a flawless financial crime. They thought the modern banking system was just a giant automated ATM waiting to be tricked by a forged signature and a fake email address. They were completely wrong. Commercial loans of that magnitude are not approved by algorithms alone. They require human oversight. Specifically, they require a senior commercial underwriter to manually verify the guarantor. The lender my father targeted was a prominent national bank headquartered right here in Chicago. What my father did not know, and what he could never have anticipated, was that the senior underwriter assigned to the Apex Build Group file was a man named David. David and I went to grad school together. He is a brilliant financial analyst, and we have collaborated on dozens of corporate fraud investigations over the past 5 years. 2 days before my parents popped that champagne, David had called my direct office line. He told me a very sketchy LLC was trying to pull a massive line of credit using a tech CEO as a guarantor. The signature looked digitally manipulated, and the IP address on the application traced back to a residential suburb, not a corporate office. He was calling me because he noticed the registered agent for the LLC shared my last name. He asked if I wanted him to decline the application and lock the file. I told him no. I told him to push the approval straight through the system. David was shocked, but I explained the situation. I told him my father was stealing Terrence's identity. If David simply declined the loan, my father would just move on to a different, sloppier bank until he eventually got the money. We needed to catch him holding the bag. I instructed David to approve the disbursement, but to immediately attach a specialized internal code to the wire transfer. It is known as a Tier 1 FBI fraud flag. It does not stop the money from moving. Instead, it acts as a digital tracking device. The moment the $500,000 hit my father's Shell account, the bank's system automatically generated a priority suspicious activity report and routed it directly to the federal authorities. My parents thought they were toasting to their brilliant deception. In reality, they were drinking champagne to celebrate the exact moment they handed the federal government all the evidence needed to lock them away. They had willingly swallowed the bait and the hook was set deep. While my father was busy celebrating his massive federal crime in his lavish kitchen, Brittany was preparing to execute her own calculated strike. She had her eyes on a prize much larger than a luxury wedding or a stolen line of credit. She wanted a permanent, legally binding stake in a tech empire. She wanted to secure her future by stealing half of Terrence. It happened on a Thursday evening, 2 days after Terrence and I had uncovered the offshore trust account. Terrence was sitting at the massive kitchen island of his downtown penthouse, reviewing quarterly software development reports for his company. The private elevator chimed, and Brittany walked directly into his home using her access keycard. She was carrying a thick manila envelope and 2 cups of expensive artisan coffee. She was playing the role of the loving, highly supportive fiancée with absolute perfection. She walked up behind him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed his cheek. She casually tossed the heavy envelope onto the granite countertop right next to his laptop. She told him it was just some boring legal paperwork. Her father insisted they get out of the way before the wedding invitations went out. Terrence pushed his laptop aside and asked her what exactly was inside the envelope. Brittany sighed dramatically, rolling her perfectly manicured eyes as if the entire situation was a massive annoyance to her. She told him it was a standard prenuptial agreement. She claimed my father had hired a family lawyer to draft it because he was old-fashioned and wanted to ensure their individual assets were clearly separated before they tied the knot. She framed the entire document as a selfless act of love. She looked Terrence deep in the eyes and told him she never wanted him to feel like she was marrying him for his wealth. She wanted to protect him. It was a brilliant, terrifying piece of emotional manipulation. If Terrence had not already spent 3 hours sitting in my office looking at forensic evidence of her theft, he probably would have signed the back page right then and there just to make her smile. But his eyes were wide open now. He picked up the envelope, pulled out the thick stack of legal paper, and told Brittany he needed to read it over. He explained that as a CEO, it was his strict policy to never sign a legal document without reading every single line. Brittany pouted slightly, complaining that it was full of boring legal jargon and reminding him they had a dinner reservation at a trendy sushi restaurant in an hour. Terrence just smiled and started reading. He sat on a leather bar stool and methodically scanned the pages. The first 15 pages were entirely standard and deeply deceptive. They covered the division of physical property, joint bank accounts, and spousal support in the event of a divorce. It all looked completely normal, fair, and mutually beneficial. But then he reached page 17. Buried deep within a section labeled Miscellaneous Asset Allocation, disguised under incredibly dense and confusing legal phrasing, was a single devastating paragraph. The clause was specifically engineered by a notorious lawyer my father frequently used for his shady business dealings. It explicitly stated that any intellectual property, software patents, or digital infrastructure created by Terrence prior to or during the marriage would be legally reclassified as joint marital assets upon the dissolution of the union. Terrence had spent his entire 20s building his software company from the ground up. He wrote the original code in a cramped college dorm room. He skipped meals, lost sleep, and sacrificed his youth to turn a single brilliant idea into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. His tech patents were the physical manifestation of his blood and sweat. And Brittany was standing in his kitchen casually sipping a vanilla latte, trying to steal 50% of his life's work. If they divorced a year from now, she would walk away owning half of his entire tech company. Terrence felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced his breathing to remain slow and completely even. He looked up from the document. Brittany was leaning against the counter, scrolling through social media on her phone, completely unbothered. She looked so innocent and so entirely harmless. She was preparing to execute a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a marriage, and she did not even have the decency to look nervous. In that exact moment, any lingering sliver of doubt Terrence had about my family completely vanished. He realized Brittany viewed him strictly as a highly profitable acquisition. They thought he was just a naive tech geek who would blindly sign away his empire because a beautiful woman asked him to. Terrence forced his face to remain completely neutral. He closed the document, tapped the stack of papers against the granite counter, and looked right at her. He smiled a warm, convincing smile, and told her the contract looked perfectly fine. He told her he just needed to grab his favorite pen from his home office so they could get this boring paperwork out of the way. Terrence walked away from the granite kitchen island and stepped into his private home office, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The moment the latch clicked, the warm, loving smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound disgust. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He walked over to his mahogany desk and opened the top drawer. Inside, resting perfectly next to his expensive fountain pens, was a cheap blue plastic pen. I had given it to him earlier that afternoon. As a forensic accountant, I have seen every dirty legal trick in the book, and I knew my father better than anyone. I knew that before my parents allowed Brittany to officially marry into wealth, they would try to secure a permanent legal claim to Terrence and his company. They would never leave a hostile takeover to chance. So I had prepared Terrence for the predatory prenuptial agreement hours before Brittany even walked into his penthouse. I bought the trick pen at a local novelty shop. The ink inside was scientifically formulated to look and flow exactly like standard blue ballpoint ink, but it was highly unstable. Within 24 hours of exposure to the air, the chemical compounds completely evaporate, leaving the paper perfectly blank. Terrence gripped the plastic pen, took a deep breath to compose himself, and walked back out to the kitchen. Brittany was exactly where he left her, still leaning against the counter, blindly scrolling through her social media feed. She did not even look up when he sat back down on the leather bar stool. "I found it," Terrence said, holding up the blue pen. He pulled the thick stack of legal papers toward him and flipped directly to the final signature page. He did not ask any further questions about the hidden intellectual property clause. He did not demand to have his own corporate lawyers review the document. He just looked at Brittany, his eyes wide and full of manufactured devotion. "I want you to know how much I trust you," Terrence told her, his voice soft and entirely convincing. "I know wedding planning has been stressful, and I know your family has been dealing with a lot of drama regarding your sister. But you and I are a team. If signing this standard paperwork makes you feel secure, then I am happy to do it. My company, my future, it all belongs to us now." Brittany finally looked up from her phone, her eyes practically shining with greedy triumph. She walked over and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, resting her chin on top of his head. "You are the best man in the entire world, Terrence," she cooed, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. "I just want us to be protected. My father said this is exactly how wealthy, successful couples handle their private assets." Terrence forced himself not to flinch at the mention of my father. He uncapped the blue pen, pressed the tip to the heavy legal paper, and signed his full legal name on the guarantor line. He dated it, initialed the margins of the intellectual property clause, just as the document requested, and signed the secondary copies. The dark blue ink bled perfectly into the pages, looking entirely permanent and legally binding. "There you go," Terrence said, sliding the completely voided paperwork back into the thick manila envelope. "All signed and ready for your father and his attorney." Brittany snatched the envelope off the counter with a speed that almost betrayed her excitement. She clutched it to her chest, like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Thank you, baby," she smiled, her face glowing with the thrill of a successful heist. "I am going to drop this off at my parents' house right now, and then I have a fitting for my reception dress. I will see you tonight." She practically skipped to the private elevator. Terrence stood in the kitchen and watched the metal doors slide shut, locking her inside. He waited 10 seconds, listening to the mechanical hum of the elevator descending to the ground floor. When he was absolutely sure she was gone, he walked over to the kitchen sink and washed his face with cold water, washing away the feeling of her fake kiss. He picked up his phone and dialed my private number. I answered on the first ring. "It is done," Terrence said, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "She took the bait. She has the envelope, and she is taking it directly to your father. By tomorrow morning, every single signature on those pages will have completely vanished, but they will not check it again. They think they own me." I sat back in my office chair, looking at the federal wire fraud files still open on my computer monitor. "Good," I replied. "Let them think they have secured their future. Let them spend the weekend celebrating their brilliant corporate theft. We have given them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. Now it is time for us to finalize the federal trap and lock the doors." At 8 on Friday morning, I pushed through the doors of a prestigious law firm in downtown Chicago. The lobby smelled of expensive leather and polished mahogany. I was not there to hire a defense attorney. I was there to see Mr. Montgomery, the senior partner who had managed my late grandmother Beatrice's estate for over 3 decades. When his secretary ushered me into his corner office overlooking the city skyline, he stood up and offered a warm smile. His sharp, intelligent eyes missed absolutely nothing, He poured us black coffee and asked what brought me to his office so early. I did not waste time with small talk. I opened my briefcase and placed a thick, organized file folder right in the center of his massive desk. I told him my father had just committed federal wire fraud and massive identity theft. I explained that the FBI and the IRS were currently finalizing a multi-agency indictment that would drop in a matter of days. Mr. Montgomery did not look shocked. He did not gasp or ask if I was mistaken. He simply let out a long, heavy sigh, took off his reading glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with a profound sense of sadness, but also a deep, validating understanding. "Your grandmother always knew this day would come," he said quietly. "Beatrice was a brilliant woman. She built her wealth through discipline and integrity, and she watched her son Richard squander every advantage he was ever given. She knew he was obsessed with the illusion of wealth. She knew his greed would eventually push him over the edge of the law. That is exactly why she made me draft a very specific contingency plan before she passed away." He walked over to a heavy steel filing cabinet in the corner of his office, unlocked it with a small silver key, and pulled out a thick bound document. It was Grandma Beatrice's original trust agreement. He brought it back to the desk and flipped past the standard distribution clauses until he reached a heavily highlighted section near the back. "When your grandmother died," Mr. Montgomery explained, running his finger along the legal text, "she left the primary family mansion and the remaining liquid trust funds under your father's control. She did it to keep the peace and to ensure your mother had a roof over her head. But she never actually transferred the legal titles to him. The assets remained securely inside the trust, and he was merely designated as the primary beneficiary and manager." He turned the document around so I could read the highlighted paragraph. "However," he continued, his voice hardening with professional authority, "Beatrice insisted on adding a poison pill clause. It is a highly aggressive legal trigger. The clause explicitly states that if Richard is ever formally indicted for any felony involving financial fraud, embezzlement, or identity theft, his status as a beneficiary is instantly and permanently revoked. The moment a federal judge signs that indictment, your father loses all managerial rights. The trust collapses and every single remaining asset, including the mansion he is currently living in, immediately defaults to you. You become the sole legal owner of everything." I read the legal jargon on the page, feeling a massive wave of gratitude for the woman who had quietly watched my father hand me that bus pass all those years ago. Even from beyond the grave, Grandma Beatrice was protecting me. She had handed me the ultimate weapon. "What do we need to activate it?" I asked, looking up at the seasoned lawyer. Mr. Montgomery pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket. "I need the federal case number, and I need your formal authorization to file the transfer motions with the probate court the exact second the authorities make their move. The transfer will be instantaneous. By the time he posts bail, he will be completely locked out of the estate." I handed him the priority tracking number provided by my contact at the bank. I signed the authorization forms with a steady hand, securing my legal right to tear down my father's fake empire brick by brick. My parents thought they were untouchable in their affluent suburban bubble. They had no idea the ground beneath their feet was about to completely vanish. I thanked Mr. Montgomery, shook his hand, and walked out of the high-rise building feeling lighter than I had in years. The legal trap was completely locked. The evidence was secured. The only thing left to do was to look my family right in the eye one last time before the hammer fell. And I knew exactly where that was going to happen. The wedding tasting dinner was scheduled for that exact evening. The wedding tasting dinner was held at an exclusive private dining club overlooking Lake Michigan. It was the kind of establishment that required a strict dress code and had a waiting list spanning several months just to secure a reservation. Brittany had demanded nothing but the absolute best for her reception menu, which meant we were about to sample 6 courses of overly complicated French cuisine. I arrived precisely on time, stepping out of my rideshare vehicle and smoothing the fabric of my dark green silk dress. I walked into the private room just as the rest of the family was getting settled around a large circular mahogany table. The room was softly lit by crystal sconces, and a sommelier was already pouring the first round of expensive wine. Ah, look who finally decided to join us. My mother. Patricia announced loudly as I took the empty seat next to Terence. She was wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light perfectly. I saw you pull up outside Olivia, still taking Ubers everywhere I see. I placed my clutch purse on the empty chair beside me and offered her a serene smile. Yes, my car is currently in the shop for some routine maintenance, I explained smoothly. And honestly, it is not so bad. Letting someone else handle the downtown traffic is quite relaxing. My mother let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Well, your father just leased me a brand new Mercedes SUV this afternoon. It has custom heated massage seats and a panoramic sunroof. I simply cannot imagine squeezing into the back of a stranger's cheap sedan. I suppose it is fine for someone in your financial position, but we have a certain standard to maintain. My father Richard puffed out his chest, looking immensely proud of the luxury vehicle he had just acquired using Terrence's stolen credit profile. He swirled the red wine in his glass, leaning back in his velvet chair. It is all about appearances, Olivia, he lectured me. When you drive a high-end luxury vehicle, people treat you with more respect. They know you are a success. You should really think about upgrading. It might help you land a better job instead of pushing papers all day. Terence shifted slightly in his seat next to me. I could feel the tension radiating off him. He knew exactly how that Mercedes had been financed, and he was currently sitting across from the man who had stolen his identity to pay for it. I reached my hand under the heavy white tablecloth and placed it gently on Terence's knee, offering a silent squeeze of solidarity. He exhaled a slow, quiet breath, grounding himself. I took a delicate sip of my water, my eyes locking onto my father. "Oh, I do not mind the Uber at all, Dad," I said, keeping my voice light and incredibly sweet. In fact, I find that not relying on flashy luxury cars actually builds character. Do you not agree? My father's arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The phrase clearly triggered the memory of the bus pass from our dinner a few nights ago, but his massive ego quickly suppressed any sense of caution. He let out a dismissive grunt and turned his attention to the elaborate menu the waiter had just handed him. Brittany ignored the exchange entirely. She was too busy taking perfectly angled selfies with her wine glass, making sure the lighting caught her massive engagement ring. "This menu is going to be amazing," she gushed, completely oblivious to the federal trap closing in around her. "I am thinking we should definitely go with the Wagyu beef for the main course." "Terrence, babe, what do you think about adding a lobster tail to everyone's plate? It will only add about $80 per person, but it will look so incredibly wealthy." Terrence looked at her, his expression a perfect mask of calm detachment. "Whatever you think is best, Brittany," he replied smoothly. "I trust your judgment completely." My mother clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, it is going to be the social event of the season," she declared. "Everyone from the country club is already talking about it. The floral arrangements alone are going to be spectacular. We are flying in rare orchids from South America." I sat there quietly observing their absolute delusion. They were happily designing a $200,000 party with money that did not exist, secured by federal crimes they thought were brilliant secrets. They bragged about leased cars and imported flowers, completely unaware that the very foundation of their elite lifestyle was about to violently collapse. As the waiter brought out the first course, a delicate truffle risotto, I picked up my silver fork. "This is absolutely delicious," I complimented the chef. "We should definitely enjoy every single bite. After all, you never know when you might have to give up this kind of luxury." My mother shot me a nasty glare, assuming I was just being a bitter spinster again. I just smiled and took another bite. The trap was set, the evidence was logged, and the clock was ticking down. The tasting dinner was their final feast of ignorance. The morning after the tasting dinner, the sky over Chicago was a heavy slate gray. Terrence and I stood in the stark fluorescent-lit lobby of the federal building. It was a massive architectural shift from the velvet chairs and crystal chandeliers of the private dining club. There was no imported champagne here, just metal detectors, armed guards, and the cold reality of the United States justice system. We were escorted up to the seventh floor, directed into a bleak conference room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Waiting for us were two seasoned federal investigators, Special Agent Davis from the Internal Revenue Service and Special Agent Ramirez from the FBI White Collar Crime Division. They did not offer us warm smiles or small talk. They were busy men who dealt with high-level corporate embezzlement and international syndicates. I sat down at the aluminum table, unzipped my leather briefcase, and pulled out a 4-inch thick black binder. I slid it across the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "What exactly are we looking at here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "You are looking at a fully documented multi-million-dollar federal fraud operation," I replied, folding my hands on the table. "It includes aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and international tax evasion. I am a licensed forensic accountant, and the primary suspect is my father, Richard. The secondary suspect is my sister, Brittany. The victim is sitting right next to me." Terrence leaned forward, handing over his driver's license and his pristine passport to verify his identity. He officially stated on the federal record that he had never authorized any commercial real estate loans, nor had he ever given anyone permission to act as a financial guarantor on his behalf. Agent Davis opened the thick binder. The first section contained the raw data from the Apex Build Group loan. I mapped out the entire digital footprint. I showed them the exact IP addresses used to submit the fraudulent commercial loan applications. The addresses did not trace back to a corporate office building. They traced directly to the primary router inside my parents' suburban mansion. I included the forged signatures side by side with Terrence's actual legal signature, highlighting the microscopic digital anomalies, proving forgery. Agent Ramirez flipped to the second tab. This section detailed Brittany's offshore Cayman Islands trust. I painstakingly tracked the $10,000 monthly increments siphoned from Terrence's premium credit cards. I provided the merchant routing numbers, the fake invoices Brittany generated, to bypass fraud alerts, and the final destination of the stolen cash. I also included a sworn affidavit from Terrence regarding the predatory prenuptial agreement she had tried to force him to sign a few days prior. Usually, white-collar crime investigations take months, sometimes even years, to gain traction. Federal agents have to wait for judges to approve subpoenas, battle high-priced corporate defense lawyers for bank records, and slowly piece together the financial puzzle. I eliminated all of that. Because I was legally tied to the family trust and used the bank's internal fraud flagging system with the help of my underwriter contact, I handed them a completely solved case on a silver platter. The two agents sat in absolute silence for nearly 20 minutes, reading through the meticulously organized spreadsheets, the bank routing numbers, and the flagged wire transfers. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of heavy paper. Finally, Agent Davis closed the binder. He looked at Agent Ramirez, who gave a slow, firm nod. "Olivia," Agent Davis said, taking off his reading glasses and looking directly at me. "I have investigated financial crimes for 22 years. I have seen Fortune 500 executives try to hide money in shell companies, and I have chased crypto scammers across 3 continents. I have never seen a civilian hand over a dossier this comprehensive. This is not just a lead. This is an airtight federal case." Agent Ramirez leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the aluminum table. "Your father used another man's social security number to secure a $500,000 commercial loan across state lines," he stated, summarizing the severity of the situation. "That alone is federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The mandatory minimums on those charges are severe. Adding the offshore tax evasion your sister is running, they are both looking at significant time in a federal penitentiary." Terrence looked at the agents. "What is the timeline?" he asked. "How quickly until you shut them down?" With this level of verified evidence, Agent Ramirez replied, "We can fast-track the arrest warrants immediately. We will have a federal judge sign off on the indictments by tomorrow morning. My father's fake empire was officially living on borrowed time. The absolute destruction of their world was now fully set in motion. We walked out of the massive federal building and stepped into the crisp Chicago air. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us. Terrence stood on the concrete steps staring out at the busy street traffic. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the kind that comes right after a doctor delivers life-altering news. The adrenaline of the meeting was beginning to fade, replaced by the profound reality of what we had just initiated. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket before we even reached the parking garage. It was a secure direct line from Agent Ramirez. He was calling to give us the official procedural timeline. He explained that while the evidence was absolute perfection, federal warrants for high-level financial crimes required a specific chain of command. They needed a federal magistrate to review the binders, sign the official indictments, and authorize a coordinated multi-agency strike team. Agent Ramirez stated it would take exactly 48 hours to finalize the operational logistics. I pulled my phone away from my ear and opened my digital calendar app. I counted the hours forward from Thursday morning, calculating the exact moment the federal agents would receive their green light. My finger stopped on Saturday afternoon. A cold, sharp realization washed over me. I looked up at Terrence, who was watching my face closely. I turned the phone screen toward him. 48 hours from right now lands precisely on Saturday at 4 in the afternoon, I told him, watching his eyes widen as he processed the information. That is the exact time Brittany is scheduled to walk down the aisle. Terrence stared at the calendar block, highlighted in a soft pastel pink by Brittany weeks ago. He had every right to call off the wedding right then and there. He could have easily sent a mass text message to his family and the guest list, packed his bags and flown to a private island to let the FBI handle the mess in his absence. But Terrence was a self-made man who had just survived an attempted corporate assassination. He did not want to quietly walk away. He wanted to watch the empire burn. "We do not cancel a single thing," Terrence said, his voice entirely devoid of fear or hesitation. "We let them put on their luxury dresses. We let your father rent his expensive tuxedo. We let them gather all their wealthy country club friends in one room. If they want to use my name to fund their fake high society lifestyle, then I want every single person they have ever lied to sitting in the front row when the federal government kicks the doors down." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological endurance. While the FBI quietly assembled their strike teams and drafted the asset seizure paperwork, my family was busy living in a state of absolute delusion. Brittany and my mother spent Friday morning at a 5-star luxury spa, racking up a $3,000 bill on Terrence's stolen credit line. They were getting gold leaf facials and deep tissue massages, completely unaware that their bank accounts were currently being flagged for federal asset forfeiture. Brittany even posted a picture of them clinking champagne glasses in their plush white robes, captioning it about how she was so blessed to have a life of such perfect abundance. My father was equally oblivious. He spent his final days of freedom bragging to anyone who would listen about his massive new commercial development project. He was strutting around his country club, buying expensive rounds of imported scotch for other businessmen using the cash he had siphoned from Terrence's identity. He was so deeply intoxicated by his own lies that he never even noticed the unmarked dark sedans that had quietly begun conducting surveillance outside his sprawling suburban mansion. They noted his every movement, preparing the exact tactical approach they would use to bring him down. Behind the scenes, Terrence and I were moving with surgical precision. Terrence met with his corporate legal team and his board of directors. He quietly briefed them on the impending scandal, ensuring his tech company was completely insulated from any public relations fallout. He legally severed all remaining financial ties he shared with Brittany, locking her out of everything except the single credit card the FBI was currently monitoring. I spent my time verifying that Mr. Montgomery had the probate transfer documents completely ready for the judge's signature. By Friday evening, the trap was fully assembled. The indictments were sitting on a federal magistrate's desk waiting for the final ink. The stolen money was frozen in the offshore trust, and my family dressed in their finest designer clothing was preparing to host the extravagant rehearsal dinner. I picked out a sleek black dress for the evening fitting attire for what felt like the funeral of their twisted dynasty. They thought they were about to celebrate the ultimate victory of their greed. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a financial slaughterhouse. The rehearsal dinner was held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel, a venue that practically screamed old money. As I walked through the heavy oak double doors in my sleek black dress, I was immediately hit by the overwhelming scent of imported white roses and expensive perfume. The room was packed with nearly 100 guests. My parents had invited every wealthy socialite, every country club board member, and every local politician they could pretend to be friends with. It was a perfectly curated audience for their grand illusion. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. I took a glass of red wine from a passing tray and found my seat near the back of the room. I did not want to mingle. I wanted a clear, unobstructed view of the entire spectacle. At the head table, Brittany was holding court. She wore a custom silk cocktail dress that cost more than most people make in a month, laughing loudly and flashing her diamond ring at anyone who made eye contact. My mother was floating between tables, her neck draped in heavy jewelry, casually dropping fake numbers about my father's latest real estate acquisitions to her country club rivals. She was glowing with the toxic satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally secured her permanent place at the top of the social ladder. Then there was Terrence. He was sitting next to Brittany, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, looking like the picture-perfect groom. But I knew the truth. I knew that beneath his calm, polite exterior, his brilliant mind was calculating every single second that passed. He smiled when Brittany spoke to him, he shook hands with my father's corrupt business associates, and he played the role of the oblivious tech CEO flawlessly. He was enduring the psychological torture of sitting next to the people who had tried to rob him blind, waiting for the federal trap to snap shut. Midway through the main course of filet mignon and butter-poached lobster, the dull roar of conversation was interrupted by the sharp, piercing sound of silverware clinking against crystal. The room fell completely silent. My father stood up at the head table. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, puffed out his chest, and looked out over the sea of wealthy guests with an expression of absolute arrogance. Friends, family, and distinguished guests. My father began, his voice booming through the ballroom with practiced theatricality. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate more than just a wedding. We are here to celebrate the merging of two incredible worlds. We are here to celebrate legacy. I took a slow sip of my red wine, letting the dark liquid coat my throat. The audacity of the man was almost fascinating to witness. When I look at my beautiful daughter Brittany, my father continued, placing a heavy hand on her bare shoulder. I see the absolute best of our prestigious bloodline. I see a young woman raised with the finest values, a woman who understands the importance of tradition, honor, and family loyalty, and tomorrow she will take those elite values and build a new empire with Terrence. He turned to Terrence, raising his crystal glass. The condescension in his posture was suffocating. Terrence, my boy, you have done well for yourself in the tech world. You built a nice little company from the ground up. But tomorrow you are marrying into our family. You are gaining access to generations of business acumen, social standing, and true prestige. We are so very proud to welcome you into our inner circle and to help guide your newly acquired wealth into a lasting legacy. To Terrence and Brittany. To Terrence and Brittany, the 100 guests echoed in unison, raising their glasses in a blind salute to a massive financial lie. I did not raise my glass. I just sat in the dim lighting of the ballroom, watching my father soak in the applause. He was standing at the absolute peak of his narcissistic delusion. He actually believed he was the king of the room, a mastermind who had successfully manipulated the system to secure his permanent wealth. He was looking down on Terence, completely unaware that the man he was patronizing had spent the afternoon sitting in a federal building, finalizing his destruction. I looked across the room and locked eyes with Terence. Amidst the cheering and the clinking glasses, we shared a single imperceptible nod. No one else noticed. No one else understood the silent communication passing between us. I looked back at my father, who was now laughing and slicing into his expensive steak. I watched him chew his food thoroughly, enjoying the luxury he had stolen. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt a cold, satisfying sense of finality. Let him eat his filet mignon. Let him drink his imported wine. Let him bask in the fake adoration of his country club friends. Because I knew with absolute legal certainty that this lavish feast was the very last meal my father would ever eat as a free man. Tomorrow his entire world was going to end. The sun rose on Saturday morning, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the city of Chicago. It was the perfect day for a high society wedding, or in my case, the perfect day for a federal takedown. The country club was completely transformed by noon. I arrived early, walking through the main courtyard, just as a fleet of commercial delivery trucks was unloading the final pieces of my family's financial delusion. The sheer scale of the extravagance was almost sickening to witness. A team of 20 event planners sprinted across the manicured lawns wearing matching headsets, barking orders at caterers and lighting technicians. Two massive swans, carved entirely out of crystal-clear ice, were being carefully hoisted onto the center of the main reception bar. The ice sculptures were designed to slowly melt into an imported vodka fountain. It was a brilliant metaphor for my father's disappearing wealth, though no one else seemed to notice the irony. Tens of thousands of rare white orchids imported directly from South America were woven into towering arches along the main aisle. The scent was incredibly overwhelming, a thick, suffocating perfume meant to mask the stench of the crimes that paid for them. I stood near the back of the massive white tent, watching the elite society of Chicago begin to arrive. The valet stand was a chaotic traffic jam of Bentleys, Ferraris, and custom Range Rovers. 500 guests stepped out of their luxury vehicles, women wearing designer silk and men in perfectly tailored tuxedos. Local lifestyle magazines and society bloggers were stationed near the entrance. Flashbulbs snapped rapidly as my mother Patricia paraded in front of the cameras. She posed dramatically, soaking up the media attention like a sponge. She gave breathless interviews about her brilliant daughter and the merging of two powerful business empires. She looked directly into the camera lenses and lied with absolute perfection, utterly convinced that she had finally cemented her legacy among the ultra-wealthy. Inside the bridal suite, the delusion reached its absolute peak. I pushed open the heavy oak door and found Brittany standing on a velvet pedestal, surrounded by three frantic tailors, making final adjustments to her dress. The gown was a $30,000 custom creation. It featured a cascading train of imported French lace and a bodice heavily encrusted with hand-sewn pearls and Swarovski crystals. It was the kind of dress a royal princess might wear, paid for entirely by the man she was planning to rob. Brittany stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, her eyes wide with narcissistic obsession. She did not look like a woman in love. She looked like a woman who had just successfully executed a bank heist and was admiring her loot. She snapped her fingers at a bridesmaid, demanding a glass of sparkling water with lemon, complaining that the room was too warm and her makeup artist was breathing too loudly. I stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching the circus unfold. Brittany caught my eye in the mirror and offered a smug, victorious little smile. She thought my silence was the ultimate sign of defeat. She thought she had won. I just smiled back, letting her enjoy her final moments of manufactured glory. I knew that less than 5 miles away, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs was already mobilizing. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the bridal suite swung open. My father, Richard, walked into the room. He was wearing a custom-fitted Tom Ford tuxedo with a crisp white bow tie. He stopped in his tracks, bringing his hands to his mouth in a rehearsed display of overwhelming emotion. He walked over to Brittany, taking her hands and telling her she was the most breathtaking bride the city had ever seen. The fake pride radiating from him was palpable. "It is time," my father announced, puffing out his chest and offering Brittany his arm. "Let us go show the world exactly who we are." The string quartet began playing a sweeping, dramatic classical piece that echoed across the sprawling country club lawn. I took my seat in the second row, maintaining my perfect poker face. The 500 guests rose to their feet in unison. The massive oak doors at the back of the venue swung open, and the crowd let out a collective gasp. Richard walked Brittany down the long, white-carpeted aisle. They moved slowly, soaking in the flashing cameras and the whispered praise of the elite crowd. My father beamed with absolute arrogance, looking left and right, practically daring anyone to question his wealth. They marched past the towering ice sculptures and the imported orchids, stepping closer and closer to the altar. Waiting at the end of the aisle stood Terence. He looked incredibly sharp in his black suit, his hands clasped firmly in front of him. His expression was completely unreadable. He watched the woman who had tried to steal his company and the man who had stolen his identity walk proudly toward him. The glitz and the glamour of the wedding was blinding to everyone else in the room, but Terence and I were just waiting for the music to stop. The string quartet hit their final soaring chord, and the music faded into a heavy silence. My father placed Brittany's hand into Terence's, giving Terence a firm, patronizing pat on the shoulder. "Take good care of my little girl," my father whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. Terence did not smile. He simply nodded, taking her hand and leading her up the velvet steps to the altar. The priest smiled warmly at the couple and motioned for the 500 guests to take their seats. A gentle hush fell over the crowd. The priest began his standard opening remarks, speaking elegantly about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of mutual respect, and the unbreakable bond of trust. Brittany stood there looking like a perfect angel playing the role of the blushing bride. I sat in the second row, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. I checked my watch. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. "We have come to the part of the ceremony where the bride and groom will share their personal vows," the priest announced, gesturing toward Terence. "Terence, I believe you have prepared something you wish to say." Terence signaled the wedding planner standing near the front row. She quickly handed him a sleek wireless microphone. He gripped the microphone, turning his body to address both Brittany and the massive audience of elite guests. Brittany. Terence started, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "When we first met, I thought I had found the perfect partner, someone who supported my dreams, someone who valued honesty, and someone who loved me for the man I am, not the company I built. Marriage is supposed to be built on a foundation of absolute transparency. It requires you to know the true face of the person you are standing next to." Brittany beamed, a single, perfectly orchestrated tear slipping down her cheek. She thought he was delivering a romantic speech. My mother was clutching her hands to her chest in the front row, glowing with pride. But over the last few weeks, Terence continued his tone, dropping the warmth and turning completely clinical. "I realized I did not know you at all. I realized that your entire existence is a carefully constructed lie. And I believe that before we move forward, our families and our friends deserve to see the exact same truth that I have seen." Brittany's smile faltered. Terence looked past the altar and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the audiovisual team. Suddenly, the mechanical whirring of heavy motors interrupted the quiet breeze. Directly behind the altar, a massive 20-foot projector screen began to descend from the ceiling rig. The guests murmured in confusion. My father stood up slightly, assuming this was some sort of surprise romantic video montage. The projector flared to life. The massive screen did not show romantic vacation videos. It displayed a high-resolution scan of an offshore banking ledger from the Cayman Islands. Terence pointed to the screen. For the past year, he announced, his voice cutting through the rising whispers, my bride has been secretly siphoning $10,000 a month from my personal credit accounts, artificially inflating wedding invoices, and hiding the stolen cash in this offshore trust. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Brittany's face drained of all color, turning a sickening shade of white. She dropped Terrence's hand and took a panicked step backward. "Terrence, what are you doing?" she hissed, her voice trembling. Terrence clicked a remote control in his hand. The screen transitioned to a new slide. This time it displayed giant screenshots of Brittany's private text messages to her bridesmaids. I read the words projected on the screen. "He is so clueless," one text read. "I got him to sign the prenup with the intellectual property trap. Once the ink is dry, I own half his tech company. He actually thinks I want to live in his boring tech bubble." The next slide was even worse. "I'm just putting up with his relatives until the wedding is over," Brittany had typed. "They are so new money. Once we are married, I'm cutting them off and routing his accounts to my dad's firm." The silence in the tent was completely shattered. 500 guests erupted into shocked murmurs, outrage, and disbelief. Terrence's family, seated on the left side of the aisle, stood up in absolute fury. Brittany was frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single lie to counter the 20-foot-tall evidence glowing directly behind her. The sheer volume of the uproar was completely deafening. Terrence's mother had to be physically held back by his older brother, her voice cutting through the chaotic noise as she demanded to know how Brittany could be so incredibly evil. My mother, Patricia, collapsed heavily into her front row seat, aggressively fanning herself and hyperventilating. The society bloggers and local media stationed in the back immediately raised their phones eagerly, live streaming the spectacular disaster to thousands of followers. Brittany finally found her voice, letting out a high-pitched shriek as she clawed at her expensive lace veil, begging the audiovisual team to turn off the massive projector. But it was my father who completely lost his mind. His carefully constructed mask of country club superiority shattered into a million pieces right in front of his elite peers. His face turned a dangerous mottled purple. He let out a guttural roar and charged straight up the velvet steps toward the altar. "You ungrateful thug!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger right at Terrence's chest. He completely abandoned his polished vocabulary, launching into a vile, disgusting tirade of racial slurs that echoed loudly through the high-end sound system. He threatened to destroy Terrence, to completely ruin his tech company, and to bury him so deep he would never see daylight. Terrence did not flinch. He did not take a single step backward. He just stood there looking down at my father with a mixture of absolute pity and profound disgust. I knew my father was prone to desperate measures when backed into a corner. I stepped out of the second row, my heels clicking sharply against the white-carpeted aisle. I walked directly to the audiovisual table stationed off to the side, gently pushing the stunned wedding planner out of my way. I picked up the secondary wireless microphone and tapped the top of it twice. The sharp thud echoed over the speakers, instantly cutting through my father's racist screaming. I pressed a button on the presentation laptop. The massive screen behind the altar flashed bright white, transitioning away from Brittany's offshore accounts to a new, much more devastating set of federal documents. Richard said, my voice echoing through the tent with a cold, terrifying authority. "Sit down and shut your mouth." My father froze mid-sentence, spinning around to face me. He looked at the giant screen directly behind him, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. Projected in 20-foot high definition was the $500,000 commercial loan application for Apex Build Group. I had used a thick red digital marker to circle the guarantor line, magnifying the forged signature and Terrence's stolen social security number for the entire audience of 500 elite guests to read. "You want to talk about thugs and criminals?" I asked, walking slowly down the center aisle toward the altar. "You want to hurl racial slurs and threaten the very man who has unknowingly funded your pathetic, luxurious existence. Look at the screen, everyone. Look closely at the highly respected real estate developer Richard." I pressed another button on the remote, bringing up his certified federal tax returns and official bankruptcy filings. The documents were undeniable. My father has been legally bankrupt for exactly 3 years, I announced, ensuring every single syllable was crystal clear. His luxury construction business is a hollow shell company. His prestigious country club memberships, his tailored silk suits, his leased Mercedes SUV, and every single imported white orchid in this room was paid for with stolen money. The crowd gasped again, the scandal suddenly deepening far beyond a bride's personal greed. Several business associates who had recently invested with my father began shouting angrily from the back rows, demanding immediate answers about their missing capital. The president of the country club stood up, looking at my father with pure revulsion. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the final fatal blow to his reputation. "He is not a brilliant businessman," I declared, staring right into my father's panicked, sweaty face. "He is a desperate fraud who stole the identity of his future son-in-law to secure a $500,000 federal loan because he does not have a single dime to his own name. He is living entirely on stolen funds. His entire life is a lie, and his fake empire is officially dead." My father stumbled backward, grasping the wooden podium for balance. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse to spin one last manipulative lie, but he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The 500 guests were staring at him not with respect, but with utter contempt. He looked desperately toward my mother for support, but Patricia was too busy hiding her face from the relentless flashing cameras. Seeing that her husband's public image was completely annihilated, my mother decided to deploy her ultimate defense mechanism. She faked a medical emergency. Patricia let out a loud theatrical gasp, clutching her chest with both hands, as if an invisible sniper had just shot her. She stumbled backward, knocking over a crystal vase filled with imported white orchids, and collapsed dramatically onto the pristine white carpet. "Oh, my heart," she wailed, squeezing her eyes shut, and waiting for the crowd of wealthy socialites to rush to her side with glasses of water and expressions of deep concern. But nobody moved. The country club elite are notoriously ruthless when it comes to social survival. Now that they knew my parents were not only broke, but also federal criminals, Patricia was essentially radioactive. The guests simply stepped back, giving her wide berth as she lay on the floor, peeking through her eyelashes to see why her performance was not working. Only a single confused teenage waiter offered her a napkin. Up on the altar, Brittany was completely unraveling. Her designer bridal gown was tangled around her legs. She realized that every single smartphone in the room was currently pointed directly at her. Dozens of live streams were broadcasting her offshore banking fraud to the entire world. "Stop recording me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure hysteria. She dropped to her knees on the velvet steps, the heavy pearl embroidery of her $30,000 dress scraping against the floor. "Put your phones away right now. You are ruining my wedding. This is a private event." She tried to crawl toward Terrence, reaching out to grab his tailored suit pants. "Terrence, baby, please," she begged, her face streaked with running mascara. "It is a massive misunderstanding. My father made me do it. He forced me to open those accounts. I love you. Please do not leave me here like this." Terrence calmly took a step back, ensuring her desperate hands did not touch him. He looked down at her with absolute indifference. "You do not love me, Brittany," he said, his voice entirely steady. "You love my bank account. And as of yesterday afternoon, you no longer have access to a single penny of it." My father was still gripping the wooden podium, sweating profusely and muttering incoherently about calling his lawyers. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You vindictive witch!" He spat, his eyes wild with rage. "I will sue you for defamation. I will take your house. I will make sure you never work in this city again." Before I could even formulate a response to his pathetic threats, a new sound cut through the chaos of the ballroom. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, but within seconds, it multiplied. It was the unmistakable, terrifying shriek of police sirens. They were approaching fast, roaring up the winding driveway of the exclusive country club. The 500 guests went completely silent, turning their heads toward the massive windows lining the back wall of the venue. The harsh, pulsing strobe of red and blue emergency lights pierced through the elegant white fabric of the wedding tent, casting eerie shadows across the ice sculptures and the floral arches. Richard froze. The arrogant bluster completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by the primal terror of a trapped animal. He looked toward the side exit, instinctively calculating if he could make a run for it across the golf course in his custom tuxedo. But he was far too late. The heavy oak double doors at the main entrance were thrown open with a violent crash. A coordinated team of 20 federal agents stormed into the lavish room. They were not wearing dress uniforms. They wore tactical gear and dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. "Nobody move." The lead agent shouted, his stern voice amplified by a handheld megaphone. "This venue is currently under federal lockdown. All exits are secured. Stay exactly where you are." Agents immediately fanned out in a highly organized tactical formation, securing the perimeter and physically blocking the side doors, the catering kitchen, and the valet entrance. The wealthy guests gasped and frantically backed away, pressing themselves tightly against the walls to avoid interfering with the federal strike team. The local media bloggers went absolutely wild, their cameras flashing relentlessly as the armed agents marched directly down the center aisle, stepping right over the crushed white orchids. I stood quietly in the second row, watching the culmination of my meticulous forensic work play out in real time. My mother stopped faking her panic attack and sat bolt upright on the floor in sheer terror. Brittany covered her face with her veil, sobbing uncontrollably. And my father just stood at the altar, trembling violently, as the lead federal agent walked up the velvet steps and looked him dead in the eye. Richard Brooks, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying the heavy weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, multiple counts of wire fraud, and bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you use immediately." My father blinked his brain, seemingly unable to process the words. He puffed out his chest one last time, a desperate attempt to assert his fabricated dominance. "You have no idea who you are dealing with," he sneered, though his voice shook. "I am a prominent developer in this city. I demand to call my attorney. You cannot barge into a private country club and humiliate me like this." The federal agent did not entertain his delusion for a single second. With swift, practiced precision, the agent grabbed my father by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the polished wooden podium of the altar. The heavy thud echoed through the silent tent. Richard let out a muffled gasp of shock. The agent pulled my father's arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut rang out like a gunshot. The custom tailoring of his luxury tuxedo wrinkled violently as he was tightly restrained against the wood. Down on the velvet steps, Brittany scrambled backward, her $30,000 lace gown tangling around her legs. She looked like a cornered animal. A female federal agent stepped forward, pulling a second pair of handcuffs from her tactical belt. "Brittany, you are also under arrest," the female agent stated clearly. "You are being charged as an accomplice to federal wire fraud and international tax evasion regarding your offshore accounts." Brittany completely lost whatever shred of dignity she had left. She shrieked a piercing sound of pure panic and began pointing wildly at Terrence. "It is his fault," she screamed, tears and mascara streaming down her face. "He gave me the credit cards. He has all the money. I am just a bride. You cannot arrest me on my wedding day. I am the victim here." The female agent grabbed Brittany by the wrist, effortlessly pulling her to her feet. "Your offshore routing numbers say otherwise," the agent replied coolly. She spun Brittany around and secured her wrists behind her back. The heavy pearl embroidery of the bridal gown contrasted sharply against the cold steel of the handcuffs. Brittany continued to sob and thrash, but the agent held her firmly in place. My mother, Patricia, remained on the floor, staring in absolute horror at her husband and her golden child. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning her fake panic attack entirely. She turned to the front row of guests, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please," Patricia begged, reaching out to the country club president and the wealthy socialites she'd been bragging to just an hour ago. "Somebody do something. Call the mayor. Call a lawyer. We are good people. We are your close friends." Not a single person moved. The elite crowd, the very people my parents had mortgaged their souls to impress, simply stared at her with cold, unblinking judgment. The socialites turned their heads away. The businessmen whispered to their wives. In the span of 5 minutes, my mother had gone from the queen of high society to a total pariah. She realized in that crushing moment that these people were never her actual friends. They only respected money, and now they knew she did not have a single dime. "All right, clear a path," the lead agent commanded, gesturing down the wide center aisle. The federal strike team formed a tight perimeter around my father and sister. The perp walk began. Richard and Brittany were marched directly down the long white carpeted aisle they had practically floated down just 15 minutes prior. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. My father, with his hands cuffed behind his back, kept his head bowed, unable to make eye contact with the hundreds of people he had lied to. Brittany stumbled awkwardly in her heavy gown, crying hysterically as two agents physically guided her forward. They walked past the towering crystal ice sculptures. They walked under the cascading arches of imported white orchids. And the entire time, the 500 elite guests watched in completely stunned silence. The only sounds in the massive tent were the heavy boots of the federal agents, Brittany weeping loudly, and the relentless rapid-fire clicking of media cameras capturing every single humiliating second of their dramatic, highly public downfall. Terrence stood quietly at the altar, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked out over the sea of shocked faces, completely unfazed by the chaos. I walked up the velvet steps and stood right beside him. We stood together and watched their fake empire totally collapse. 1 month later, the crisp autumn air had settled over Chicago, sweeping away the lingering stench of imported white orchids and shattered illusions. The fallout from the wedding raid was spectacular, brutal, and incredibly swift. The federal justice system does not care about country club memberships or tailored silk suits. When the government has an airtight case wrapped in a neat forensic bow, the wheels of justice turn with terrifying speed. My father, Richard, was currently residing in a federal holding facility in downtown Chicago. His high-priced defense attorneys, the ones he always bragged about at dinner parties, abandoned him the moment they realized he could not pay their exorbitant retainers. He was forced to rely on a public defender who looked incredibly exhausted during the initial arraignment hearing. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched the judge read the federal indictment. Richard looked small, frail, and utterly pathetic in his orange jumpsuit. His arrogant bluster was completely gone. The judge took one look at the scale of the identity theft, the forged commercial loans, and the international wire fraud, and immediately denied bail. The judge cited Richard as a severe flight risk and remanded him into federal custody until his trial. For a man who had spent his entire life obsessed with appearances and luxury, the reality of a concrete cell and a metal toilet was a devastating psychological blow. He was looking at a mandatory minimum of 15 years, and at his age that was essentially a life sentence. Brittany was not faring much better. She had spent the first week crying in a county jail cell before my mother finally managed to scrape together enough borrowed cash to post a fraction of her bail. But freedom was entirely relative. Brittany was confined to the suburban mansion with a bulky GPS ankle monitor strapped to her leg, facing multiple felony counts for her role in the offshore trust conspiracy. She had tried to play the helpless victim, claiming our father manipulated her into opening the accounts. But the federal prosecutors had my forensic spreadsheets. They had the digital footprints of her creating the fake invoices, inflating the wedding vendor costs, and personally authorizing the wire transfers. Her own text messages mocking Terrence proved her malicious intent beyond a shadow of a doubt. Her court-appointed lawyer informed her that she was facing serious jail time, and the only way to reduce her sentence was to fully cooperate and testify against our father. The golden child was now actively plotting to send her own father to prison just to save herself. The public narrative had also experienced a massive, highly satisfying whiplash. Remember that viral video Britney posted, the one where she sat in a luxury closet crying about her jealous, racist older sister? That video was completely deleted within hours of the raid. In its place, a massive wave of national news articles flooded the internet. Major financial publications and digital news outlets ran front-page stories with headlines exposing the country club con artist and the runaway bride. The same internet mob that had viciously attacked my professional reputation just a few weeks prior suddenly turned their collective rage onto Britney. Social media influencers dissected her fraudulent lifestyle, turning her into a cautionary tale of greed and digital manipulation. The comment sections were absolutely ruthless, filled with thousands of angry people demanding she face the maximum possible sentence for her crimes against a hard-working tech founder. As for my professional life, the results were nothing short of phenomenal. The managing partner at my forensic accounting firm, the man who had nervously suggested I issue a public apology, called me into his office the Monday following the raid. He did not ask for an apology. He offered me a massive promotion, a substantial raise, and a permanent partnership track. The media coverage had specifically highlighted the meticulous forensic investigation that led to the federal indictments. My name was everywhere in the corporate financial sector. Within a single month, our accounting firm saw a 300% boom in new business. Corporations, wealthy private investors, and even regional banks were clamoring to hire the brilliant forensic auditor who had fearlessly dismantled her own corrupt family. My calendar was booked solid with high-paying elite clients who wanted me to audit their portfolios and track down hidden liabilities. I moved into a larger corner office with a beautiful panoramic view of the city skyline. I was no longer just an employee pushing papers in a cramped cubicle. I was one of the most highly respected fraud examiners in the entire state of Illinois, commanding premium consulting fees. I had taken the absolute worst betrayal of my life and transformed it into the ultimate career triumph. While my professional life was soaring to unprecedented heights, the final piece of Grandma Beatrice's brilliant contingency plan was quietly working its way through the Cook County Probate Court. The federal justice system is incredibly methodical. Exactly 3 weeks after the dramatic raid at the country club, the United States Attorney General officially unsealed the formal multi-count federal indictment against my father. He was no longer just a suspect being held in custody. He was a formally indicted federal defendant facing decades in a penitentiary. That official piece of paper with the federal seal stamped on the bottom was the exact trigger we had been waiting for. The very next morning, I received a brisk, highly anticipated phone call from Mr. Montgomery, my late grandmother's estate attorney. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply told me to come down to his downtown office immediately because we had a very important appointment with a probate judge. I walked into the massive marble courthouse, feeling a strange sense of calm. There was no anxiety, no lingering guilt about dismantling my parents' lives. I was simply executing the law. We sat in the judge's private chambers, far away from the chaotic public courtrooms. Mr. Montgomery presented the unsealed federal indictment alongside Grandma Beatrice's original trust documents. He directed the judge's attention to the specific poison pill clause she had so carefully drafted all those years ago. The judge, a stern-looking woman with decades of experience dealing with messy, wealthy families, read the documents carefully. She cross-referenced the federal case number, verified my identity, and reviewed the strict stipulations of the trust. It took her less than 10 minutes to make a ruling. My father had breached the foundational terms of the trust the exact second the federal grand jury handed down his indictment for financial fraud. His status as the primary beneficiary was legally and permanently terminated. The judge picked up her heavy black pen and signed the execution order. It was a completely silent administrative action, but the magnitude of that signature was astronomical. In a matter of seconds, the entire remaining family fortune shifted. The sprawling suburban mansion, the remaining liquid investment accounts, and every single valuable asset locked inside the trust were instantaneously transferred into my sole possession. Mr. Montgomery handed me the thick, freshly stamped property deed. I ran my fingers over the heavy parchment paper, staring at my own name printed boldly on the owner line. I was now the absolute legal owner of the multi-million-dollar estate where I had grown up being treated like a second-class citizen. I owned the grand marble foyer where my father used to scream at me. I owned the lavish dining room where my mother had humiliated me. I owned the very roof over their heads. While I was sitting in a quiet courtroom securing my new empire, my mother was sitting in that exact mansion, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was now legally trespassing on my property. Patricia had spent the last 3 weeks living in a profound state of denial. She had locked herself inside the house, refusing to answer the door or look at the news. She genuinely believed that once the initial shock wore off, her husband's expensive lawyers would magically fix everything, and her comfortable, luxurious life would simply resume. But reality was already bleeding through the cracks of her delusion. Earlier that week, 2 burly men in coveralls had arrived with a tow truck and legally repossessed the brand-new Mercedes SUV my father had leased using Terrence's stolen credit. The bank had immediately frozen every single joint checking and savings account associated with my father's name. Patricia's platinum credit cards were declining at the grocery store. She was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, who had built her entire identity on spending money she did not earn, and she was suddenly left with absolutely nothing. She had no cash, no car, no husband, and no friends. The elite country club ladies had completely ghosted her, ignoring her desperate phone calls and deleting her from their group chats. The only thing she thought she still possessed was the massive, beautiful house. She thought the mansion was her ultimate safety net, a fortress of old money that the federal government could not touch because it was protected by the family trust. She did not know that the trust had already detonated. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the crisp autumn sunlight, holding the property deed securely in my leather briefcase. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local sheriff's department to schedule a civil standby. It was time to pay my mother a visit. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the suburban mansion 30 minutes later. Right behind me, a black and white Cook County Sheriff cruiser rumbled to a stop. 2 uniformed deputies stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting their heavy utility belts and giving me a professional, reassuring nod. We walked up the manicured brick path together. I did not bother knocking. I pulled my old brass key from my purse, the one my parents constantly complained about me keeping, slid it into the heavy oak front door, and pushed it wide open. The interior of the house was a scene of absolute pathetic chaos. The grand marble foyer, usually perfectly staged to impress wealthy country club guests, looked like a luxury retail store had been violently ransacked. Cardboard moving boxes were scattered everywhere. Expensive Persian rugs were rolled up haphazardly against the walls. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen flanked by the 2 silent deputies. My mother Patricia and my sister Brittany were frantically rushing around the room, completely consumed by their own greed. Brittany had somehow managed to post a secondary bail, likely draining the very last of my mother's hidden emergency cash reserves. She was wearing a bulky black GPS tracking ankle monitor strapped tightly over her designer yoga pants. She was awkwardly limping back and forth between the living room and the kitchen, aggressively shoving a stack of expensive Hermes silk scarves and limited edition purses into a massive canvas duffel bag. Patricia was standing by the walk-in pantry, desperately trying to wrap a collection of solid silver serving trays in bubble wrap. When she heard the heavy footsteps of the deputy's boots hitting the floor, she spun around. Her face was pale, her makeup was smeared, and her usually perfect hair was a disheveled mess. "What on earth are you doing here?" Patricia shrieked, dropping the roll of bubble wrap. The heavy plastic clattered loudly against the imported tile floor. "And why did you bring the police into my home? Get out of here immediately before I call my husband." I walked calmly toward the massive marble kitchen island. Brittany froze, clutching a fistful of silk scarves to her chest, her eyes darting nervously between me and the armed deputies standing firmly in the doorway. "This is not your home, Patricia," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the cavernous kitchen. It has not been your home for a very long time. Do not be ridiculous, Olivia. Your father's lawyers are handling everything. It is just a minor federal misunderstanding. We are simply packing a few essentials to move into a luxury hotel until the media stops harassing us. Now tell these officers to leave before I file a formal complaint against you for trespassing. I unzipped my leather briefcase. I pulled out the freshly stamped property deed and the official court order I had secured less than an hour ago. I dropped the heavy stack of legal documents right in the center of her precious marble island, right next to a pile of stolen jewelry. You are not going to a luxury hotel, I explained, looking her dead in the eye. And my father's lawyers dropped him the second his credit cards bounced. But more importantly, you need to read the first page of that document, right there. Patricia cautiously stepped forward, leaning over the marble counter. Her eyes scanned the bold black text and the signature of the probate judge. Her face completely drained of color. Her jaw went slack as she read my name printed as the sole legal owner. Grandma Beatrice's trust had a poison pill clause, I told them, watching the devastating reality finally sink in. The moment a federal judge signed the indictment for Richard's massive financial fraud, the trust automatically collapsed. He was stripped of all beneficiary rights forever. The estate, this mansion, the bank accounts, and every single valuable asset purchased with those funds legally defaulted to me. I am the absolute sole owner of this entire property. Brittany dropped the scarves onto the floor. "You cannot do that," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That is our stuff. Those are my designer bags. I need those to sell so I can pay my defense attorneys. Those bags were bought with stolen money." I shot back, my voice turning to ice. "Money you stole from Terrence. Money my father stole from federal banks using a fake identity. Therefore, it all belongs to the estate to be liquidated for legal restitution." I pulled one final document from my briefcase. It was a single sheet of paper with a bold red heading. I placed it directly on top of the deed. "This is an immediate eviction notice," I announced, tapping the crisp paper. The judge signed off on a 0-day grace period due to the ongoing federal criminal investigation and the extremely high risk of asset destruction. "You have exactly 15 minutes to pack whatever basic clothing and essential toiletries you can physically carry in one standard suitcase each. You are leaving all the designer bags, the jewelry, the silver, and the artwork right where it is. If you attempt to take anything else, these deputies will arrest you for theft." Patricia grabbed the edge of the marble island, looking like she was going to be physically sick. She looked around the giant kitchen, finally realizing the game was completely over. "You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street," she gasped, her voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Where are we supposed to go, Olivia? We do not have any money. We do not even have a car." "You have exactly 14 minutes left," I replied coldly, stepping back and folding my arms. "I suggest you start packing." Patricia did not move toward the empty cardboard boxes. Instead, she tried the one tactic she had relied on her entire life whenever she was completely backed into a corner. She weaponized her motherhood. She took a slow, agonizing step toward me, letting out a fractured, heartbreaking sob that would have won her an Academy Award. "Olivia, please," she begged, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. She reached out her trembling fingers, hovering just inches from my arm, though she did not dare actually touch me. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water. I carried you. I gave birth to you. I raised you in this house. You are my daughter, and a daughter does not throw her own mother out onto the street like a common criminal." Brittany immediately chimed in, leaning heavily against the counter as if the sheer weight of her ankle monitor was dragging her down. "I cannot walk to a shelter, Olivia," she whined, pointing frantically at her designer yoga pants and the bulky black plastic strapped to her calf. "Everyone will see me. The paparazzi are probably waiting at the bottom of the hill. I will be ruined. We are your flesh and blood. You have to protect us." I looked at the two of them standing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar kitchen that was paid for with shattered lives and stolen identities. The deputies stood silently by the door, their hands resting near their radios, completely unmoved by the theatrical performance. "You do not get to use the word family today," I replied. my voice remaining entirely flat and devoid of any emotion. Family is supposed to protect each other. Family is supposed to build each other up. To you and Dad, family was nothing but a financial arrangement. I was just a walking credit score you thought you could manipulate, and when I refused to play along, you turned into monsters. You called me a bitter spinster. You tried to ruin my career. You cheered when Dad threatened to steal my house. Patricia swallowed hard, the fake tears instantly drying up when she realized the emotional manipulation was completely failing. But we had no choice, she hissed, a flash of her true venomous nature breaking through the crying facade. Your father was under so much pressure. We just wanted to maintain our standard of living. And you were willing to destroy Terrence to do it. I shot back, stepping closer and forcing her to look me in the eyes. You sat at tasting dinners, drinking expensive wine, laughing about the luxury cars you bought with his stolen social security number. You cheered for Brittany as she tried to steal half his company. That is not family, Patricia. That is a criminal syndicate. And your time is up. You now have 9 minutes. The reality of the ticking clock finally shattered their paralysis. Panic completely took over. Patricia let out a frantic shriek and scrambled toward the laundry room, grabbing a cheap nylon duffel bag she used for gym shoes. Brittany abandoned her pile of silk scarves and hobbled toward the downstairs bathroom, wildly throwing basic toiletries, toothbrushes, and half-empty bottles of drugstore shampoo into a small tote bag. They were bumping into each other, crying and hyperventilating, realizing they could not take the diamond tennis bracelets, the imported crystal, or the custom-tailored suits. They were reduced to exactly what they were before the stolen money: absolutely nothing. At the exact 15-minute mark, the taller deputy stepped forward. "Time is up, ma'am," he said firmly, resting his hand on his utility belt. "Drop anything that does not belong in those 2 bags and move toward the front door." Patricia zipped up her pathetic nylon bag. Her hands were shaking violently. She looked around the grand marble kitchen one last time, her eyes tracing the expensive crown molding and the imported chandelier. She slowly dragged her feet toward the foyer, looking completely aged and broken. Brittany followed closely behind the plastic ankle monitor, scraping loudly against the floorboards with every step. They reached the heavy oak front door. Patricia turned around, her face twisted in a mask of genuine humiliating defeat. "How are we supposed to leave?" she asked, her voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance. "The tow truck took my car this morning. Brittany's car was seized last week. We have heavy bags and we have absolutely nowhere to go. You cannot just leave us stranded in the driveway." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply opened my tailored leather purse and reached inside. I pulled out 2 freshly printed, neatly laminated transit cards. I walked over to the marble entryway table and dropped them onto the polished stone surface. The sharp click of the plastic echoed perfectly in the silent foyer. The Mercedes was seized, I told them, staring blankly at the women who had made my life a living hell. "You will need these to get to the downtown shelter." Patricia stared at the 2 blue and white city bus passes resting on the marble. Her breath hitched in her throat as the memory of the restaurant dinner hit her like a physical blow. "Remember?" I said, delivering the ultimate finality with a perfectly calm, icy precision. "Taking the bus really builds character." Brittany let out a loud, miserable wail, snatching the 2 passes off the table, because they literally had no other option. The deputies opened the front door, ushering the 2 sobbing women out into the cold autumn air. I stood in the doorway and watched them drag their cheap bags down the long brick path toward the street. I waited until they reached the sidewalk, and then I grabbed the heavy brass handle. With one firm push, I swung the massive oak door shut, the loud, satisfying click of the deadbolt echoing through my new quiet empire. The heavy oak door remained shut, and for the first time in my entire life, the sprawling suburban mansion was perfectly quiet. There was no more screaming, no more arrogant boasting, and no more suffocating perfume. The toxic energy that had poisoned these walls for decades was completely gone, swept away, along with the 2 women currently waiting at a city bus stop in their designer yoga pants. 6 months passed since that dramatic morning. I did not sell the massive estate. Instead, I completely renovated it from top to bottom. I tore out my mother's gaudy imported marble and my father's dark, oppressive mahogany paneling. I opened up the floor plan, letting the natural sunlight flood into rooms that used to feel like an emotional prison. The house finally felt like it belonged to me, or rather, it felt like it belonged to the woman Grandma Beatrice always knew I could become. On a warm Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my newly installed quartz kitchen island, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee. The front door chimed and Terence walked in. He did not bother knocking anymore. We had moved far past the formalities of polite acquaintances and forged something much stronger. We were bound by the intense shared experience of surviving a financial war zone. Terence looked healthier than he had in over a year. The dark, exhausted circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a tech visionary who had his empire securely under his own control. He tossed a thick leather-bound portfolio onto the quartz counter and pulled up a bar stool right next to me. "The beta testing phase is officially complete," Terence announced, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the French press. "The algorithms are currently running with a 99.9% accuracy rate. We are fully ready for the initial public rollout next quarter." I opened the leather portfolio, carefully reviewing the finalized executive summaries. After the spectacular downfall of my family, Terence and I realized we were sitting on an absolute goldmine. We combined his unparalleled expertise in artificial intelligence and cloud infrastructure with my high-level forensic accounting algorithms. We created a proprietary state-of-the-art business-to-business software specifically designed to detect, isolate, and terminate complex financial fraud in real time. We built the exact system that would have caught my father on day one. Our newly formed corporate partnership was already securing massive contracts. Major commercial banks, international lending firms, and private equity groups were practically throwing money at us to integrate our proprietary software into their underwriting departments. We were conservatively projecting our first-year revenue to be in the high 8 figures. My father spent his entire life committing massive federal felonies just to pretend he was a multimillionaire. Terence and I were about to legitimately double that wealth before the end of the fiscal year, simply by catching desperate, greedy people exactly like him. We did it. I smiled, signing my name on the final incorporation document and sliding it back across the counter. Terence picked up the portfolio and raised his coffee mug. To dodging bullets and building empires, he toasted a genuine relaxed smile spreading across his face. He finished his coffee, gave me a brief supportive hug, and headed out to his waiting car to prep his corporate board for our upcoming software launch. I stayed in the kitchen for a few more minutes, simply listening to the peaceful silence. I had won the war, secured my financial future, and permanently excised the cancer from my life. It was finally time to celebrate. I walked down the long hallway and pushed open the heavy steel door to the climate-controlled garage. My father used to keep his fleet of leased luxury cars parked here, desperately projecting his fake success. Now the garage was entirely empty, except for a single vehicle resting under a heavy canvas tarp in the far back corner. I walked over and pulled the dusty canvas back. Resting perfectly preserved underneath was Grandma Beatrice's pristine vintage 1969 Porsche 911. It was a flawless classic machine, painted a deep metallic silver. My father had spent years begging her to let him drive it, and she had always refused, knowing his reckless arrogance would somehow ruin it. She left the title securely locked in the trust, waiting for the day the estate finally transferred to the rightful owner. I slid into the low driver's seat. The vintage leather smelled rich and authentic. I turned the silver key and the powerful engine roared to life, a deep mechanical growl that echoed loudly off the bare concrete walls. I pressed the button to open the garage door, shifted the classic car into gear, and pulled smoothly out of the long brick driveway. I drove away from the quiet suburbs and merged onto the highway, pointing the sleek silver hood toward the open coast. The windows were down, the crisp spring wind was whipping through my hair, and the speedometer was steadily climbing higher. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I did not see a bitter spinster. I did not see a secondary character in a fraudulent family drama. I saw a brilliant, wealthy, entirely independent woman who had burned a toxic bloodline to the ground and built an absolute fortress from the ashes. Family isn't blood. It's respect. If someone hands you a bus pass while handing someone else a car, don't cry. Own the bus company. Subscribe and comment below.